Yo, what is up, guys? Delboy here, aka Blue Collar Sports TV. Hopefully, you guys are all doing well. If you're new here, if you could smash the subscribe button, it really helps me out. And also, if you could hit the like button, it goes a long way to push the channel in the YouTube algorithms. Anyway, something a little bit different today. A fantasy fight between Gennady Golovkin and Froch. This topic has kind of resurfaced recently, at least amongst the people I'm subscribed to. I know the guys at BDA Boxing were talking about this fight fairly recently, and that was basically because Froch came out into the media and he said that he would have been too big and too strong for Golovkin. Now, who would have won this fantasy fight? I think the first question is, when does the fight take place, and at what weight? I'm just going to assume that the fight takes place at 168, and in regards to the time frame, I think there's two ways we can look at this. The first of which being when the fight realistically could have taken place, and on the other side, a prime versus prime hypothetical matchup. We'll talk about when the fight realistically could have taken place first. So, the fight could have taken place in 2014/2015. Froch just got done beating George Groves in May 2014, and at that time Golovkin was trying his best to get a big fight. If the fight took place in that time period, despite Golovkin moving up, I would make Golovkin a fair favourite. You have to consider at this time, Gennady Golovkin was an extremely hungry fighter, and Froch was a guy on the way out. Froch was coming off several back-to-back hard fights. He had a few wars, took a fair bit of punishment. He was getting towards his late 30s, and, he was starting to slowly decline. Quite frankly, I actually believe Froch retired at the perfect time. But if the fight took place in that time period, I would have to favour Gennady Golovkin, to be honest with you. And in that time period, I would have actually favoured Golovkin fairly heavily. I mean, at that time, Golovkin was a lot fresher than Froch, and a lot more hungry, and again, at that time, Froch was openly talking about retirement. He basically had one foot out of the door, and that mindset, going in there with somebody like Gennady Golovkin, is the worst possible mindset to have, because Gennady Golovkin obviously is a seek and destroy type fighter. He applies pressure, he hits extremely hard, and that Golovkin was extremely hungry. So for a guy to be thinking about retirement, fighting that Golovkin, despite Golovkin being smaller, he's in for a rough night. And, I just don't really see that Froch beating Gennady Golovkin. I think Golovkin would have successfully closed the distance and used that ramrod jab to control Froch, and Golovkin would be picking away at Froch on the front foot, just slowly chopping him down round after round after round. Froch would definitely have success. Golovkin is a guy who obviously can be hit. His defense isn't bad, but if you're trying to walk Froch down, you best believe he's going to throw back and he's going to trade. And in those moments, I fully expect Froch to have success against Gennady Golovkin. Even that version of Froch, he would have given Golovkin problems in the exchanges, but I just don't think that Froch at that time would have had enough to negate Gennady Golovkin for 12 rounds. Again, he would certainly have his moments, but I just don't believe he would do enough, to be honest with you, against a younger, fresher, hungrier fighter who's more technically sound. I just believe Gennady Golovkin would have basically outboxed Froch on the front foot. I actually believe the fight would kind of resemble Gennady Golovkin versus David Lemieux. However, the fight would go the distance, and Froch would actually win some rounds and give Golovkin problems, but ultimately he wouldn't do enough to get the decision. So when this fight could have actually happened, I would have favoured Golovkin by a clear decision. Like a 9-3, maybe an 8-4 type of fight, but Golovkin would win clearly on the cards, in my opinion. However, if we're talking about this fight from the perspective of both guys being in their prime years, so for example, I would say Froch's prime was 2008 to 2012, and Golovkin's prime, sort of 2012, 2013, 2014. If the two guys fought in their respective primes at 168, I do believe it's a much different fight. I do believe it's a hell of a lot more competitive, and quite frankly, hypothetically, if this fight would have happened, I believe this would have been one of the all-time classic super middleweight fights. I think it would have been a fight of the year contender and an absolute war. A prime Carl Froch would have just had more in the tank to deal with somebody like Golovkin, and he would have been a bit more active, a bit more aggressive, and he would have met fire with fire. And if Carl Froch could have actually pushed Gennady Golovkin back, he would have more than likely had a fair bit of success. Golovkin can certainly box off the back foot. You know, people say he's terrible on the back foot. I disagree. But if you're actually applying real pressure and throwing punches, Golovkin's not quite as effective. We saw against Lemieux. You know, Golovkin was boxing behind the jab, taking a step back. He looked great. But when Derevianchenko pushed him back and was throwing and trading, he didn't look so hot. Same with Canelo in the second fight. And even Kazim Umar, for example. When you back Golovkin up by throwing punches and giving him something to think about, he's not quite as effective. And if Froch, with his size, with his strength and solid punching power, if he could push Gennady Golovkin back, then he'll give Golovkin problems. But obviously walking down somebody like Golovkin is obviously a risky assignment. Even somebody as tough as Carl Froch would have felt that type of power and that accuracy from Golovkin. So it's one of those things. I'm sure Froch would have got success on the front foot, but you know, he would have had to walk through a lot of punishment to get there. And ultimately, in those type of fights, you favour the guy with better technique and a better skill set. And I believe Carl Froch isn't on Golovkin's level in terms of skill. He's got the size on Golovkin, and I would say he's physically stronger, but in terms of pure skill, Golovkin's a few levels above. So despite prime Froch's size giving Golovkin problems, despite his strength giving Golovkin problems, I still believe Golovkin's superior skill set will win him the day. I don't see a way Carl Froch can take Golovkin's jab away from him. Carl Froch was always susceptible to a good jab. We saw that in the George Groves fights, the Andre Dirrell fight, the Jermaine Taylor fight. You know, he struggled with these jabs. Golovkin's got one of the best jabs in the business. I don't see how he takes that weapon away from Golovkin, and that's one of his main weapons. You know, it's not just a regular jab, it's basically a power punch, and that shot takes a lot out of you. You know, that really busts your face up and causes damage. And on top of that, of course, Golovkin's got the other artillery. Great punch variety, works the body, you know, great overhand right, left hook to the head. I just believe Golovkin's superior variety, his superior technique all round, will just be a bit too much for Carl Froch. So in a prime for prime hypothetical matchup, I would still pick Gennady Golovkin, but I do believe it would be a much closer fight, and it would be an absolute war. Maybe a 115, 113 type of fight for Gennady Golovkin. But yeah, I would pick Golovkin to win a close points decision. But a very hard fight, and even potentially a fight that's controversial, to be honest. But yeah, prime for prime, I say that's pretty much an even fight, but I would lean towards Gennady Golovkin to win on points. So to summarise, when this fight could have actually happened in 2014, 2015, I would say Golovkin comfortably on points. In a prime for prime scenario, I would say a razor close Golovkin win on points. So I'm going with Golovkin both times. I don't think Golovkin would have stopped Carl Froch, to be honest. Froch was obviously the bigger man. Yes, he got hit, but he had a very good chin, to be honest. And yeah, I just don't see Golovkin stopping Carl Froch. If he were to stop Carl Froch, it would have been in the 2014-2015 fight, when Carl Froch was older and, you know, he was coming off a few wars. Potentially then Golovkin could have stopped Froch, but even then, I would still pick Carl Froch to go the distance. The guy was just very tough, with a very good chin. A lot of people, when they talk about this fight, tend to pick Golovkin by stoppage, and I can see why. You know, Carl Froch wasn't exactly a defensive wizard, and maybe the accumulation of shots would be too much, but a lot of these guys act like Carl Froch would have been an easy fight for Golovkin. I totally disagree, and let's be honest about it. The people picking Carl Froch to get knocked out, I think they're overinflating Golovkin a little bit. I mean, you could make the argument, the four best guys Golovkin's fought, he's not been close to knocking out. Canelo twice, Danny Jacobs, and Sergey Derevianchenko. Yeah, he hurt these guys at times, but he was never really close to knocking these guys out, so why is he going to knock out a bigger man in Carl Froch? Again, I know Carl Froch doesn't have the defense of a Canelo, a Danny Jacobs, or even a Derevyanchenko, but he's a bigger dude with a granite chin. He's as tough as nails. And yeah, I just don't see Golovkin stopping Carl Froch at 168. And another thing to consider, one thing that's hard to really tell, is how would have Golovkin even looked at 168? Maybe the power is not as effective at 168. Who knows? Interestingly enough, just to throw it out there, Martin Murray, who fought George Groves and Gennady Golovkin, he said Golovkin's accumulation was much more impressive than George Groves, and every single shot was extremely hard. However, in terms of pure one-punch power, he said George Groves' right hand was harder than anything Golovkin threw. So, Carl Froch took that power. Yeah, he got dropped in the first fight, but he took the power. Could Golovkin really stop Carl Froch? I'm not so sure. To be honest. I would pick Carl Froch to go the distance. But nevertheless, I would pick Gennady Golovkin in a fight when they could have actually fought in 2014, 2015. And I would also pick Golovkin in a hypothetical prime for prime matchup. Anyway, share your thoughts below. Tell me what you guys think. Peace.